South Korea today is a world-recognized industrial producer, all from very humble beginnings. Though many believed it impossible, South Korea successfully industrialized. The core of the economic miracle that was South Korea's economic rise was heavy and chemical industry, the commanding heights. HCI was a symbol of economic self-reliance in the newly independent South Korea. The dream of HCI had been held by the Seungmin Rhee and the Jangmyeon governments, and the Park Chung-hee government also had such aspirations. In the 1962 five-year economic plan, Park Chung-hee government envisioned not only the construction of 4 hydroelectric power plants and 8 thermal power plants, but also fertilizer, oil refining, cement, integrated steel, machine tools, shipbuilding and automobile producing facilities, i.e. every major area of heavy industry. But without the necessary funds, such plans remained on the drawing board. Much of the more ambitious parts of the plan were scrapped, leaving only the refinery and the fertilizer factory. A refinery was soon built in Ulsan, and fertilizer plants built in Ulsan and Jinhae. Refining and fertilizer capacity were just a part of heavy and chemical industrialization. Further HCI capacity would require large amounts of foreign currency. Normalizing relations with Japan and sending Korean forces to Vietnam would provide much of the funds required. In June 1965, the Korean-Japanese Treaty of Normalization was signed. $800 million as reparation fund was a massive sum given that South Korean exports were only $119 million in 1964. Normalization allowed also South Korea to import much-needed advanced technology, know-how, and information from Japan. The deployment of troops to Vietnam was a major foreign currency earner. In 1964, the United States requested the deployment of South Korean forces. Expecting that deployment would result in multiple benefits, the Korean government agreed to deploy forces. The number of South Korean armed forces sent to Vietnam amounted to 310,000 men. Of those deployed, 5,000 were killed in action and 11,000 injured. During the deployment, the pay of soldiers and workers, as well as the revenue of Korean contractors there, totaled $740 million, money earned through blood spent. With the U.S., Korean, Japanese security alliance consolidated, foreign capital inflows began to increase rapidly. Foreign loans were only the $40 million in 1965. By 1969, however, they reached $500 million, exceeding 12-fold. The government used this foreign capital to finance the construction of a petrochemical works in Ulsan and an integrated steelworks in Pohang. Petrochemicals were the inputs for light industry, including synthetic fibers. In October 1972, after 4 years in investment, totaling $250 million, the Ulsan petrochemical complex was completed. Thereafter, the supply of basic materials dramatically improved. The Park government sought to construct an integrated steelworks with the support of U.S. magnates in 1965, having been proposed but put off in the original first 5-year plan. But in April 1969, the plan came to an end when U.S. steelmakers involved could not obtain loans. Then it was decided to use a large amount of Japanese reparations for the project. To make the project work, the government spared no expense, funding the building of needed infrastructure and providing tax breaks. Planned capacity was also increased to 1 million ton a year. In December 1969, South Korea and Japan reached a basic agreement for the construction of an integrated steelworks. $178 million of foreign capital and 49.3 billion won of domestic funds, a total of 120.4 billion won invested, the most expensive project in the history of Korea. June 1973, finally the dream of an integrated steelworks was realized. In the late 1960s, the HCI plan accelerated as a result of a security crisis. At the time, tensions between North and South Korea escalated as North Korean provocations intensified. This is at the very time when globally, detente went forward between the East and the West. The United States withdrew one of the 2 divisions it had stationed in South Korea. Japan and the United States began efforts to normalize relations with the People's Republic of China. Park Chung-hee interpreted these changes in the international situation as a severe crisis for the state. He saw no alternative but to pursue an independent defense policy and create a defense industry capable of producing the weapons for national defense. So in 1970, the government put in place a plan to build what it termed the 4 core industrial facilities and set up the Agency for Defense Development to nurture the domestic defense industry. However, unable to obtain loans, the 4 core industrial facilities plan did not get off the ground. Then Park Chung-hee organized an HCI team that included Kim Jong-nam, President House Chief of Staff, and Oh Won-chul, the second Secretary on Economic Affairs.
정부는 이제부터 중화공업 육성의 시책의 중점을 두는 중화공업 정책을 선언하는 바입니다.
In 1970s, the massive investment in HCI led to what was called the then biggest boom since Dangun, Dangun being the legendary founder of the First Korean dynasty. In the 1976 to 78 period, annual economic growth exceeded 10%, and manufacturing growth reached 16.6% a year. Except for the machinery industry, every industry involved exceeded its growth target, while the $10 billion export target was met in late 1977, 4 years earlier. It was at this time 2 of South Korea's major industry, cars and shipbuilding, were built. From the early 1960s, complete cars were made from imported components. Production increased, but spending on import of components required a lot of foreign currency. Thus, in the early 1970s, the government sought to domestically produce cars and the parts involved. In 1974, Kia produced the foreign model-based Brezza 1.0-liter car with an engine designed in-house. Hyundai began to produce Pony Car in 1976, South Korea's first own model car. From the 1970s, the government also moved to foster the emergence of a shipbuilding industry. The Ministry of Commerce and Industry got Gulf, the American supplier of crude oil to South Korea, to use oil carriers built in South Korea. The Korea Shipbuilding Corporation supplied Gulf with 12 small, 20,000 to 30,000 ton ships. In October 1971, Jung Ju-young, head of Hyundai, concluded a contract with a Greek shipping company to supply them with 2 massive 260,000 ton ships to be delivered 2.5 years later. The Korean government guaranteed delivery. With loans secured, it began constructing a shipyard in Ulsan. Shipbuilding began soon after, while facilities were still under construction. From 1973 until early 1974, Hyundai built 12 massive 300,000-ton ships. Amid difficult circumstances, workers and technicians successfully learned how to build ships. They greatly raised productivity, narrowing the gap with Japan. It was this dynamic ability to learn that would ultimately lead to South Korea becoming the world's #1 shipbuilder. With the sudden death of Park Chung-hee in October 1979 and the resulting political crisis, the economic crisis the country faced also worsened. The new military regime, led by Chun Doo-hwan, saw Park Chung-hee's HCI as the cause of the economic crisis. The new military government ousted the Ministry of Commerce and Industry's HCI line. The government attempted to restructure investment in the particularly bad-performing car and electricity generation equipment industries. The Chun Doo-hwan government also changed industrial policy. It ended preferential treatment. These economic stabilization and rationalization policies resulted in rapid growth, returning in the early 1980s. And in 1986 to 88, the economy boomed. It was the car industry that expanded particularly rapidly in this period. In the early 1980s, the way for the vulnerable Korean car industry to survive was to invest in small model cars, creating a mass production system for export. Hyundai cars invested to create capacity to produce 300,000 small cars per year. The investment proved to hit the mark. With the U.S.-Japanese trade deficit rising and the trade conflicts worsened, the Japanese car industry cut back on exports of small cars to the U.S. The newly opened gap in the market was seized by Hyundai. Hyundai Pony XL car exports grew rapidly. Exports of 16,000 units in 1983 rose to 564,000 in just 5 years. It was one of the 10 hit products in the United States at the time. Since then, the Korean car industry, with constant improvements in performance and active marketing, has grown into the 5th largest worldwide. In the 1980s, another industry that succeeded was semiconductors. In 1983, Samsung's Lee Byung-chul designated semiconductors a key industry for the firm and entered the DRAM market. In November 1983, Samsung developed 64K DRAM. They had an expertise gap of 5 years compared to the most advanced makers. The gap in product development with Japan was closed by November 1992. When developing 64 MDRAM, Korean RAM was of the same level as American and Japanese. In the 1990s, South Korea began to export DRAM in large quantities. As PC ownership increased rapidly worldwide, demand for DRAM also soared. Orders for South Korean DRAM rolled in. From 1993, South Korea became the #1 maker of semiconductor memory worldwide, and it was the 3rd largest producer of semiconductors generally, with only the United States and Japan producing more. Beginning with steel, petrochemicals, shipping, and all the way up to cars and electronics, HCI was the driving force behind Korea's economic rise. With the government leading the way, the ambition of industrialists, the ability of workers and engineers to learn, as well as their hard work, made HCI possible. Koreans sought to create the industries of an advanced country: steel, chemicals, machinery, and electronics, as if to show to those who did not believe it possible, they succeeded. HCI turned South Korea into a top 10 economy in the world, playing a crucial role in creating a better future.